Good afternoon and welcome to an EAS Consulting Group webinar on medical device product risk management presented by EAS independent consultant John Lincoln. EAS, a member of the certified group of companies, is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA. Our network of over 200 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. From strategic product development, preparation of technical submissions such as 510Ks, or assistance with Form 483s and warning letters, EAS offers the detailed knowledge and experience your company requires. Today's presenter is John Lincoln. John assists medical device companies with production and validation issues, including gamma sterilization, QS, 510Ks, export clearance, and injection molding, to name a few. He conducts trainings, both public and in-house, and has written several chapters and books offered by RAPS and others on verification and validation. John has compiled many 510Ks and IDEs and also assists software development teams in compiling documentation. During the webinar, you may ask any questions of John by typing them into the questions box, and we will save all questions for the end. With that, I will say thank you for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to John.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for attending. I'd like to emphasize the Q&A. Most cases when you attend a webinar or any kind of a training session, the questions come later, usually when we start to think about how do I apply this to my present situation, my own needs and my own company. As a result of that, I've done these webinars for over 14 years, not for EAS, but for other companies as well. And in that time, I've always offered the advantage that once you've attended, once we shut down, if you think of a question, maybe in the next day or two, send it to EAS. It'll be directed to me. I'll develop an answer for it, and we'll try to send all the questions and answers we get in the first couple of days to all of you in attendance. If you think of something months later, contact EAS or myself, and I'll be happy to respond individually to the question. Of course, I am a consultant. If you ask a question that really is a project, that's a different story. I'd charge for that, or EAS would charge for that. But in most cases, we can answer questions or point you in the right direction as a no charge, and it's a benefit to me. Now, when we look at the title, 10 Steps to Effective Risk Analysis, where first of all, we're talking about device or product risk analysis. ISO 14971 is geared to medical devices. ICH Q9 is geared to pharmaceuticals. However, the model I discuss here is suitable for ICH Q9, as well as ISO 14971 for devices. And 10 steps is my numbering. This material can be developed in many different ways to satisfy regulatory requirements. But I should mention that this presentation has been field tested. It's gone through numerous FDA inspections and numerous notified body audits, and has been used several times to remediate compliance issues as a result of a regulatory agency's audit or inspection. So certainly it's very beneficial in that respect, but bear in mind that this is only one way to do it. There could be many other approaches, but this is a field tested approach based on decades, if you will. So first of all, we're going to look at the latest revision of 14971, which is 2019. There were several other revisions, but the two most prominent we'll cite a couple of times is 2007, which said reduce risk as low as practical, and then 2012, which said reduce risk as low as possible, which created a lot of heartburn. And 2019 has changed back to allowing any number of different ways to reduce risk, but basically performing a benefit risk. They changed it from risk benefit to benefit risk analysis to show that the benefits outweigh the risk to the patient. Now remember, the end result of these the standard ISO 14971 is geared to patient safety. The very opening of it pertains to that. You'll probably hear me mention this several times. I've done several audits or inspections for companies overseas that are under notified bodies, one in Asia, several in Europe. And as a result of 483s from the US FDA or warning letters from the US FDA because of the fact that they produce products that end up in the United States. So they are inspected by FDA resident posts located in other countries outside the US. They got glowing reports from their notified body inspection, and then they fail their FDA inspection. And one of the key reasons why is on this definition of risk. So one of the key takeaways I'd like you to have from this presentation is when the FDA talks about risk, they're only talking about one kind of risk: patient, user, clinician, and to a lesser degree, environmental use environment risk. They aren't talking about financial risk. They aren't talking about scheduling risk, budget risk, or anything like that. Now in Europe, they're under also ISO 31000, which talks about these other risks. And the European Union is used to that. So when they look at 14971, they incorrectly look at it in terms of any kind of risk when it's directly associated with patient user risk. And that's a key takeaway we want to keep in mind throughout this discussion. We're going to look at life cycle because this is a cradle to grave type of activity. As I mentioned, the 10 steps are arbitrary. They're what I use and what I've used for many years, and they passed scrutiny by both regulatory agencies on both sides of the Atlantic. And we'll talk about some of the other feed-ins to a risk management activity. We'll also talk about the risk management file. And again, you're given many options. And I'll discuss the ones I am here. Some of you may look at FEMAs and FEMECAs and immediately have heartburn because you've heard other consultants say those are not appropriate tools for risk management. I disagree, and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about how we can address some of the complaints that are raised about a FEMA or FEMECA on the outside. But again, I've never had a problem with either a notified body or a FDA inspector on the use of those tools. We'll talk about team involvement and some recommendations I have based on experience, and how the risk management file should be a living document under change control and subject to revision as additional information comes out regarding post-marketing information or industry information as well. So as I mentioned, this is only one approach among many, and it has been field tested. And the model I present is useful across all medical products. So it is a model, and it's not copyright or anything. You're welcome to use it. You're welcome to modify it however you see fit. But the 10 steps is my personal model that I've used for many, many years. And one of the first uses was in an adversary arrangement where the FDA had a major problem with a multinational company, and basically had several of their agents planted in various sites of that company. And one of the areas they were dealing with was risk management files, creation of those files. As a consultant, I was brought in and worked with the FDA on developing those files, and each file went through a panel review by the FDA inspectors that were on site, usually about 3 or 4 of them. So what I'm presenting has been carefully looked at. Now, obviously, it's changed a little over the years as a result of changes to 14971. But basically, the major approach is pretty much the same. So this is a field-tested approach. But as I mentioned, it's not the only option. Now, I want to emphasize that in red. I put it in red because of the fact that we want to emphasize when the FDA says risk manage, or they say involve yourself in a risk-based activity like software validation. It's a risk-based activity. They're meaning you have to trace all the activities down to what effect this could possibly have on the end user or the patient as a result of whatever activities perform that piece of equipment you're validating, for example, or that software, et cetera. Same goes for your CAPA analysis, your corrective and preventive action analysis, and other activities that are their length is determined by the risk to the end user. Now, You're subject to the standard, both in US and over the Atlantic and Europe. You're also subject to your own SOPs that should be based on the standards, the GMPs in the United States, the medical device regulation overseas, and similar, or if in pharmaceuticals, the comparable for the pharmaceuticals as well. The FDA checks to see your SOPs are in compliance with what's applicable in the GMPs. And then from that point onward, if they find that they are, then they audit you or inspect you to your own SOPs. And that's where the problems come up, because companies fail to follow their own SOPs, resulting in their product being deemed adulterated. Now, if you're working with a notified body, as I mentioned, everything I'm presenting here has gone through notified body inspections with no problems. But once in a while, you may find a notified body that has a preference for a certain definition or term or approach. By all means, follow their recommendation under the notified body. And more than likely, if it's within the bounds of what we're discussing here, the FDA will also accept that variation. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware of the fact that the GMPs for devices is undergoing change to make it more in line with 13485, as it did years ago, to make it in line with old ISO 9001, which then subsequently changed after the FDA changed the GMPs 820 for devices. So that's in a little bit of a state of flux. Even though there's a movement toward having one inspection satisfy both models, European and United States, I think by the point I've already made, the FDA still has a stronger definition for a few things, one of those being risk, patient risk. So even though we were saying that they're almost identical systems, there's still a tendency that I find when inspections are conducted, even very recently, that the FDA inspection is much tougher than the notified body inspection. Although the new medical device regulation has kind of given the European notified bodies a little more teeth, even though they're paid for by their client, so to speak. So one thing that slide mentioned too about definitions, I know individuals on internet forums get really hung up on definitions. My experience with notified bodies and the FDA is they do not get hung up on definitions. If your definition is reasonable, it's fully explained, it ties in with official definition, like in the GMPs or an ISO, and it's followed. So that's the key point as we get through here. Now, in the 14971, as on the FDA's website, on some of their documents, both parties recognize that the use of a medical device entails some degree of risk. There's no getting around it. Paragraph 8 brings out that the manufacturer makes that judgment regarding safety. But remember, the regulatory agencies have the right to look over your shoulder and disagree with you. So if you get into an area where it's kind of a gray area and you feel you're solid on it, make sure you have good justification in writing in your file. And we're talking about the risk management file in this application. Now, the old 2017 or excuse me, 2007, 2012 abstract mentioned these kind of requirements as well. And they talk about the ALARP, as low as reasonably practical, or that was changed to as low as possible in 2012. And that was a scene of much confusion in the industry. Hence, one of the key reasons why 14971 was revised again in 2019. But it also changed the report to review the summation of this activity, and further increased the going beyond the device itself to your system, having a risk management system in place that's defined, as well as the risk management analysis of individual devices. And like I mentioned, I use the model that we'll be talking here also for pharmaceuticals or dietary supplements under ICH Q9. That doesn't mean you have to, but it works pretty much the same way. I think more and more, and probably that's evidenced by those of you signing up today, recognize that risk is becoming a growing concern by regulatory agencies, and should be a growing concern among companies, not just because they want to be in compliance, but because the population demands it, the users demand it, and their lawyers demand it. So there's a growing emphasis, and to cover all the bases, including accessories, as we mentioned there. So we have life cycle, cradle to grave considerations in your risk management, post-production, obviously, more and more, not just with implants and other high-risk products, but across the board. And we're dealing with estimation, and we'll see that as we get into it. Obviously, senior management should be involved in all of this, as well as full support of your quality management system. And use error has always been a no-no. To me, and the FDA as well, it tends to be a default complaint resolution, which is not a resolution. The FDA feels that you need to reduce risk as low as possible. You need to do it to reduce use error, mistake-proof products, use engineering, IEC 62366-1, use engineering, human factors engineering. The FDA started emphasizing that in the year of 2000, and now, of course, we have the update to IEC 62366-1 on use engineering to push away the use error factor. Generally, when it's a user error, it's generally viewed as a design problem on the part of regulatory agencies. And in most cases, they are fully justified in that conclusion. Now, obviously, senior management has to be behind all of this to work. The late Dr. Deming really emphasized that in his 14 principles. Things don't happen unless senior management is on board. And that's the FDA has recognized that for many years, including their process validation document, which came out in 2011 for pharmaceuticals. And you notice here, the last bullet point, well, the two last bullet points talk about a hazard coupled with the exposure to that hazard by the individual results in a hazardous situation or condition. And that hazardous situation or condition, the probability of occurrence equals the calculated harm resulting from that hazard. Now, as we go through this, you'll notice that in the times past, we used to calculate a risk priority number, severity times probability times control, or effectiveness of control to prevent that fault from occurring in the manufacturing process. But now probability and control have been combined under probability. And so although you'll see some references to control in our discussion here, ultimately that has to be folded into probability. So you're basically dealing with severity times probability to consider the overall risk of your product. You have to have a plan for the individual, and you have to have a plan for your entire quality management system to control risk. When I go through this file and report, I use a traceability matrix. If it's not official, I have an unofficial copy that I check off all my hazards that have been dealt with the supplemental documentation. But generally, I like to, if I'm going to do the effort of doing that unofficially, I'll just make it a formal official document. I also do that by commonality of numbering between the several different documents that support the hazards being exploded into other documents, which we'll explain a little bit later. And then the end result, there used to be a risk-benefit evaluation, but now it's a benefit-risk evaluation, and it does have to be done. It's no longer optional as it used to be with 2012. As I mentioned, ICH Q9, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you notice some of the same kind of tools can be used. Near the bottom there, methodology, a failure mode and effect analysis, or a failure mode and criticality, effect and criticality analysis, a fault tree analysis, hazard analysis and critical control points, which is a tool geared to the food industry with the FDA, but as mentioned here, and HAZOP, this is generally geared more to process activities such as chemical processing, the hazard operability analysis. I don't use that. I don't use HACCP, and I don't use the PHA, preliminary hazard analysis, but they are tools mentioned in ICH Q9, and they could be used not only in ICH Q9, but also in 14971. In fact, the latest version of 14971 2019 eliminates references to the various supporting tools you can use. In the past, they did recommend FTAs and and FEMAs and FEMECAs and similar, although not all of those, but they could be used as well. I've never seen pushback from any inspector in the use of those tools, but the recommendation is use at least 2 of them, not just one. So as I mentioned, this is a 10-step model. It's my own approach. It's been used by many of my clients. It's been used by others with modification, their own variation. Remember, when we talk about the GMPs, we usually add a C in front of the GMPs, current good manufacturing practices. The FDA defines current good manufacturing practices as you're not going to pass an inspection by just following the written regs. If you go to the Code of Federal Regulation, 21 Code of Federal Regulation, CFR 820, and just follow that's what's written in law, that's the law, that's the very basic bottom line. But they expect more, and that's where the current comes in, the C. That means that you have to be in the middle of your industry. Right now, your industry is doing quality manuals. Quality manuals are not mentioned in the GMPs. They're doing many other things. Risk management isn't specifically called out as implied, but having a risk management file isn't called out in design control, for example, 820.30, but it's expected then. And even use engineering is expected per the FDA and per the European Union, even though it's not specifically called out in 820.30 or in 1345 7.3 design and development planning, which is identical to the requirements of design control in 820.30. So this approach has worked, and it's been accepted by regulatory audits and inspections. So what are the 10 steps? Well, product risk management, your system has to be corporate-wide and then site-wide, and then down to the product level. In the past, 14971 was focused at the device or product level, but now it still has a device focus, but it also is expanded to include the entire quality management system from cradle to grave. Now we'll look at some of the things involved in the file, but I recommend in your file you have a narrative and a composition of the team. The hazard list is the first key deliverable. It's the shortest list of all the possible hazards your product presents. And then I recommend a fault tree analysis. We'll show examples of all this. A design FEMECA, failure mode effects and criticality analysis, a process FEMECA, production process, and a use FEMECA. And I generally trace all the DP and U FEMECAs all the way to the user anyway. And I include software in there. I used to have a separate software FEMECA, but I just fold software into all of this because basically it's in everything anyway. And then finally your report or your review, which sums up everything, talks about residual risk, and talks about the benefit risk analysis to justify the release of your product to the field, even though there's some risks, residual risks involved. So what's the step one? The step one is risk management planning in your company, and that includes ESOP. So this is an expansion from the previous versions of 14971 to the 2019 version, where it calls out more specifically the need to address risk company-wide in your manufacturing process, in your quality assurance process, and every other activity that could affect the outgoing quality and risk-free nature of your product, or almost risk-free nature of the product that's shipped to the field. And when we mention cradle to grave, this is what the expectation of the FDA is. This is from one of their non-copyrighted slides or illustrations that shows the concept of how risk must be, well, not just risk, but this is what I'm focusing on, how risk is involved in all these various activities in developing a product from concept to delivery to the patient and use by the patient and disposal, even if you want to consider that. So it gives you a rough idea of all the steps that you have to consider risk as part of your overall system. So initially, you're looking at a risk assessment. Now, I'm presenting this linearly, step 1, step 2, step 3, etc. But in reality, you're going to start in one area and maybe add a little more to another area and so on, then go back and flesh out some. And as you work on one area, you might find you have to go back to one of the other areas and flesh it out or modify it a little. It's a lot of reiteration, if you will. And that's the reality of it. But I'm presenting it in a straight sequence. Now, risk assessment is discussed in many different publications issued by the FDA, and it's also been in the previous versions of 14971 as well. And you consider that some of these activities, they still apply to 2019 as well. And it's for current product, change product, and new product. Remember, whenever you change a product, you have to consider its effect of the change against the existing 510K. And surely you would have to modify and update your 14971 risk management file in accordance with that. You have to consider the individual change, and you have to consider the collective effects of all the changes to determine whether you need to file a new 510K. But in all these cases, you should be looking at whether I need to update my risk management file. So the scope should be broad-basing, not only just covering your device from cradle to grave, but also looking at your management system that controls all of this, all the production, as well as the design, the inspection, the shipping, the storage of your product and its components. As I mentioned earlier, this is not going to succeed without this commitment of senior management. And the commitment has to go beyond, we got to be in compliance because we don't want to fail an inspection. It has to be, we have to be in compliance because this provides us with the best tools of shipping the least risky product to the end user, the patient. I've worked in companies where the employees didn't want to use the products manufactured by the company on themselves or their loved ones because they were concerned with how it was manufactured. In one case, we actually changed the production line around over a period of a year to reduce the defects down from like a 66,000 defects per million to a 1 to 100 basis, and from an attitude where the workers did not ever want to see that product on a loved one, to the point where that was the product of preference. So that has to have senior management backing, the funds involved to make those corrections, to develop a product that is as low risk as possible to the patient. Now, the product level, the risk management plan, and remember, this is still the first step. We're listing various aspects of this planning activity. And you notice some of the things: periodic review is required, documented in the file for the product. And then, of course, you may either have an individual file or portions of elements in the applicable file, or spelled out in SOP and checked by some kind of periodic annual check for your entire system as well, under change control. Now, risk management should be part of your design control activity. Obviously, the best time to eliminate risk from a design of a product is when it's undergoing design. So as you develop your risk management file or your design history file, and you're going through your design control requirements of 820.30 or 1345 7.3, those 10 steps, one of those would be involved in dealing with risk management, as well as, if necessary, use engineering, human factors engineering, because the changes necessary as a result of those activities, risk management and use engineering, the change to design should occur early on, not later on when it's expensive to change or politically hard to change. So it's very important. I mentioned down below some databases. In the house would be your CAPA, your corrective and preventive action complaints, your non-conformances, your complaints from the field, your out of specification conditions. The FDA has a device manufacturer use and device experience database, adverse events. You'd certainly want to check that out for comparable type equipment manufactured by others to see if there's something that could even threaten your item. Look at trade journals, look at the consumer's report of the hospital industry, ECIR, and similar type publications. as well. Be aware of what's happening in your industry, not just in your own company, regarding that product's use in the field or that family of products use in the field. So step one is the overall planning, broad-based as well as narrow to the device level. But then step two is now you're getting into the nuts and bolts of your actual device itself. And so you have an SOP. You undoubtedly have a design control SOP. In that, it may reference another SOP on risk management and developing the risk management file. And in that, I'd recommend you have in that file, you have a narrative, you have a list of your hazards. I like to use a fault tree analysis, but you can use any other tool. And I like to have the 3 types of Mechas, but you can use other tools as well. And then a final review, replacing the old report in terminology, with a benefit risk, replacing the old risk benefit. So these are the kind of things I included in the narrative: a description of the product, how it's used, what interfaces are to the external environment, whether it's sterile, non-sterile, its 510K number, if it's a class 2 device, a PMA, etc. Who uses it? What is the environment in which it's used? Is it in a trauma unit? Is it OR, ER, at home use, whatever? Interface, connect to oxygen, connect to the plumbing system, electrical or battery, risk assessment sources, tools I used, or maybe my own company's CAPAs, maybe even some numbers referenced, NCMR numbers, assumptions. No matter how you go through this activity, you're going to find you are basing it on how far you drill down on assumptions tied to risk to the patient. And then the hazard analysis. And like I mentioned, I use a fault tree analysis, 3 Mechas, and then I have the review under the conclusions. Some of the sources for additional information from post-production as well. FIRs or failure investigations. Usually that's part of a CAPA investigation or a complaint investigation. We mentioned MAUD, Manufacturer and User Device Experience Database, part of the form 3500A that you submit when there's an adverse event in the field. The old MDR system, MDR, FDA MDR, not European MDR. Now, selecting a team, I include this in here because I like to emphasize that second point. Whenever I'm doing risk management, I like to have a clinician familiar with the product and its use in the field for that procedure, so they can comment on the risks to the end user by the use of that product on that end user in the field, and environmental pressures, etc. That could be a registered nurse, a physician's assistant, it could be a doctor or other clinician. Sometimes companies have these individuals as members of their board, or maybe as an employee in a company. Some larger companies might have a nursing staff, and they might be familiar with that procedure. They may not. You may have to get a consultant that's familiar with that, who's a clinician. But I recommend very strongly that a clinician be brought in toward the second half of the development of this file to review values of risk priorities, but also to make sure everything is complete in terms of the various risks and hazards presented. So then this is the approach I've done. I've started with a committee from the very start, which is very painful and time consuming. I usually start with a team, select a team, but don't present them anything at the beginning. I develop the skeleton myself as a team leader, and that's the approach I recommend. And you may say, well, I don't have any knowledge in this area. And that may be partially true, but you'd be surprised. Once you start digging into it, you can get some basics down and list, and I use a Gantt chart to control it. I get the milestones, usually most of the milestones in, and then I start fleshing out the tasks. I start asking other functions that will have to feed into this, what they would need and when they would need it, and I'd add that to it. And then once I've got it structured that way, then I present it to the team. I may project it up on a wall, and then we go through it line item by line item, maybe several times, maybe the whole thing once or twice, and then specific areas that are creating some heartburn with the team more frequently until we get agreement on everything. The biggest difficulty in getting agreement is the values assigned to the risk priority numbers, usually, unless you're dealing with defects per million opportunities in your company, and you usually drive it off of that, which is unusual in what I've seen. So then number 4 is the narrative. That's the beginning discussion, the scope, the purpose, etc., and the item itself, the description of the item, regarding whether it's sterile, biocompatibility issues, how it's used, what population it's used on, indications for use, the formal statement from your 510K, etc. Then the team members and titles, we mentioned that earlier, with a clinician, preferably. You don't have to. The standard does not call for that, but I strongly recommend it. Okay, then step number 5 is we develop the hazard list. So here's where we actually get into the main body of the rest of the activity. The hazard list will drive all your other documents. This is a key list of the hazards that your device presents to the field. Now, I'm starting to address some of the complaints that you see sometimes regarding using a failure mode and effect analysis in this by consultants on the internet, is they say it doesn't consider normal use. And there aren't a lot of things that are normal use that cause injury or death, or serious injury or death. But bear in mind that one example I usually use is anaphylactic shock. You can have warnings on your device about allergies, etc. And we see them all the time on other things. But what if a person's never been allergic to the things that are mentioned in the past, but over constant exposure to them, they may have developed an allergy they weren't aware of, and now they use your device. It has that component in it that has an allergen they're now allergic to, and they go into anaphylactic shock, which would kill them if they don't take immediate action. To me, that's a normal use that could result in a serious effect. And so I incorporate normal into my failure mode effect analysis. I'll show you how. Those of you that are purists that object to a failure mode, including normal, have a separate one. Have a normal effect analysis, or a list structured to address the same kind of concerns that you have in your FEMA and FEMECA, but address it some way. That, to me, eliminates the issues that the field has about the use of a failure mode effect analysis in this procedure. But bear in mind, in the older versions of 14971, FEMA or FEMECA was called out as a acceptable tool. And I've never had a regulatory agency question me on the use of it. And nor have I had them question me on my inclusion of normal in the use of those tools. But that's up to you how you do it, but do address normal. Here's an example of severity based on a narrative on the right-hand side, and using a numbering system 1 to 5. The automotive industry does a lot of these risk management activities for automotive, not people, and they usually use a 1 to 10. And the FDA was trained by some automotive consultants on FEMAs and FEMECAs, so they're familiar with 1 to 10 as well. But most of the people I work with generally have a 1 to 5 scale. And if you have defects per million opportunities, then instead of may cause death or whatever, you have the percentage. 1 out of 1 cause death, or 1 out of 1,000 can cause serious injury, that kind of a thing. But most companies I deal with are not that sophisticated in terms of defects per million opportunities with accurate value numbers like that. So you're dealing with a more subjective type narrative to establish your numeric values. Okay, so here again, now for years I've used severity, probability, and control. I still figure in control in my probability, but that's up to you. In most cases, probability has to consider the effectiveness of controls to eliminate the probability of that occurring anyway. So hence they're just the two of them are combined. And that's your risk priority number. You may or may not choose to use a risk priority number, but I like to use it because I use my risk document to determine validation test cases, how many test cases I do on something, how risky is that particular question or requirement I'm trying to answer with a test case. And I tie it into a risk priority number off of a risk management file to justify my selection of a fewer number or a larger number of test elements. That's one approach of doing a risk-based validation, for example. So the hazard analysis is the key document that may have 10, 15 key areas or whatever that your product can cause a hazardous situation in the field. But then from that, you explode it into all the other ones on in my case, a fault tree analysis and the Mecha or FEMA. And so when I'm developing that, I have the hazard list pretty well locked in. And then I develop the FTA and the FMECAs back and forth. And that may cause me to maybe add something to the hazard analysis. Usually it doesn't. It's pretty complete. But it may definitely cause things to adjust between my FTA and my FMECAs. You notice some of the areas for each fault. Use the things to mitigate it, to drive it down to as low as possible, which is now allowable under the new 2019 version of 14971. So once you do the hazard analysis, then you can do the other 4 documents. So the first one is a fault tree analysis. Now, you've probably seen some of these. That should be instructions. It's overridden by the picture there when we went from this extended format. I apologize for that. Basically, it's 2 electronic symbols used in this, logic symbols. In the very top there, you'll see what looks like a little rocket ship, a truncated rocket ship, a pointed top and a convex bottom. This is an OR gate. In other words, everything entering in the bottom in this particular drawing, any one of those things entering in the bottom can cause the defect exiting on the top. Down below on the left-hand side, you'll see a rounded, like an inverted U with a flat line across the bottom. That's an AND gate. In other words, both occurrences of problems entering in the bottom, both of them have to occur for the problem mentioned on the top to occur. So in most cases, when I draw one of these, in the majority of the cases, I'll be using an OR gate. In other words, any one of the problems entering in can cause the problem exiting. And then I use a continuation symbol as a diagram, and an end symbol is usually a circle or oval. That's the way I use it. And that's similar to what's available on the internet in terms of what's recommended for a fault tree analysis. Here's one I've done. It's only one page of quite a few pages. You'll notice each one of those triangles directs you to another page. But you notice here, I'm using 2 key OR gates. Any entry on the bottom results in the problem coming out of the top. And you don't see even one AND gate there. That doesn't mean that you can't use them, but usually it's hard to find. It's a lot easier to indicate that everything entering in can cause that defect on the top. If you have some that you have to have a combination, I'd have a branch off and have an AND gate next to it with those items separate. Another example. And you see, this is one of the last pages because the circles down the bottom indicate the first step, whereas the others were continuations, the square, the rectangles, etc. I draw these on Visio, but you can use any kind of tool. Step number 7 is develop your design for Mecha or FEMA. Now, generally, I include the RPN in a FEMECA. Otherwise, I don't usually have an RPN value in a FEMA. But that's generally the way I use it. I haven't been able to find a standard definition of that across the board, and so I define it that way in the SOPs that I utilize, and that's what I'm used to. But If you have a standard you like to refer to and you are a purist and want to follow that to the letter, then you have to compensate by what that standard does not allow by something supplemental, like, for example, the addressing of normal. So you're considering, I like to consider all risks ultimately down to the end user. That's the key. I'm not talking about budget risk, business risk, et cetera. That has to be consideration for profitability of your company, yes. And you have to consider that. But as far as the FDA is concerned, when you're doing a risk analysis for your product under 14971, that is not a consideration. Financial and budget and delivery time and for marketing is not a consideration. Only this risk to the patient is. Here's an example of probability, 1 to 5 as well, and a narrative. And then, as we mentioned, severity, not for the hazard list, but for the FEMAs. And then control, which would be lumped into probability. You could do one of two things. You could still end up with a 1 to 5 total for probability, which includes control, or you could have a 1 to 25 for you have a 1 to 5 for the probability and 1 to 5 for control. If your system is such that there's a clear distinction between the two, and then you combine them together, and that would affect your subsequent terminology. Here's an example of a design. Now you go on the internet, you can find all kinds of formats. You may have a one that's spelled out in a standard you prefer. You may have some engineers that went to the university and were trained in a certain way on this and may prefer to do it that way. Structure your SOP to allow for that, because my experience with both FDA and notified body is no one format is favored over others, as long as they achieve the same purpose or benefit. In this particular case, you see controls split out from probability, but they'd ultimately have to be combined together in the final analysis per the latest 14971. Process, same kind of activity. I've shown some of these a little bit different, each one, but they can all be the same, basically. They pretty well cover the types of failures that occur, as well as normal use issues that occur in design and in manufacturing process and production process and in your field use. Now here, if I had normal, I just included under that left-hand column. You notice all those are failures. I would also include normal. For some of you that might gag over modifying a FEMA or Mecha that way, I would have a separate document that would be structured very similar to this, and then I have my normals. But in most of the case, you're not going to have very many normals. And the same applies for the use. I apologize for that truncation that occurred when the slide format was changed for this presentation, I guess. Now here, I'd probably eliminate that Mecha type because it's obviously use Mecha. That'd be the title of it. And I'd put it maybe failure normal or failure period, or use it for something else. Because if it's always going to be failure, then that'd be the title of a Mecha, use failure Mecha, which is what the F stands for. And then you develop your review. And as I mentioned here, this is an iterative process, a reiterative process. And you consider all the elements involved. Your team should be heavily involved in this as well. And everybody should be able to come to a relatively good agreement. As I mentioned, I like to involve the team after I have something they can look at, a skeleton, so to speak, that's fleshed out. It's probably 80, 90% there, depending on my knowledge of the subject and my ability to get other people that are knowledgeable to give me feedback to structure the effort, which I structure on a Gantt chart, my milestones and my tasks. These 10 elements would be milestones, and under each of these 10 elements would be the various tasks. Like narrative might be one element, a milestone, but then the narrative would include the K number, is it sterile, all those other items, team members, assumptions, etc., that we mentioned earlier. Those would be tasks. Then where does this fit into the hierarchy of documents in your company? Well, although the GMPs do not require you have a quality manual, the expectation on the part of the FDA is that you do have a quality manual showing your SOPs and how they tie into the GMPs. And so that's part of the C in CGMP, as I mentioned earlier. Now, technical files, design dossiers, they're still in existence, but they are being phased over to, and they should have been as of last June or May, of this year, 2021, extended out from the switch from the European Medical Device Directive to the Medical Device Regulation. So now it's all technical documentation if you're dealing with European. But here for the US, you have to have a quality manual. You have to have standard operating procedures / work instructions / forms. You have to have design history file to show compliance to 820.30. Or in Europe, a design and development file, which is identical to the design history file, which is in harmony with ISO 13485 7.3, design and development. And then risk management files. I like to include an actual copy that existed at the time we did the development of the product in the design history file. But you can certainly just have a pointer to the one. And it'd be good to point to the version that was applicable when you did the design, because things may have changed since then, and you'd like to see what drove the design, what risk management elements. The same applies to usability. Not everything requires a usability file. Everything does require a risk management file, but not every product requires usability. If it's a purely Me Too product, a lot of 510Ks are, but not completely, then you may not. Now, that's not a rule. You have to make that own decision yourself. But where you are, you heavily involve other people in the use of your product that would have the knowledge comparable to your user base. And that's one of the key underlying factors of IEC 62366-1. -1 is a regulation, -2 is how you apply the regulation. So whenever you see the word, this is a risk-based activity, like on the FDA's website, you'll see software is a risk-based activity, software validation. Think risk management file. Think proving how far you go on some activity based on the risk involved to the end user, and be able to tie it to some specific point in the file. That's what I like to do, to eliminate all argument, all discussion afterward. And the file should be a living document. It should be under change control. In the US, whenever you find some risk issues of change in the field, maybe by good or bad, then you have to plug that into your risk management document under change control. If you're in Europe, there's automatic change control, because every time you change your technical documentation, you have to have it re-audited by your notified body to maintain your CE mark for the countries in which you're selling the product. So that's kind of an automatic thing beforehand. With the FDA, you're kind of on your good behavior until they come to inspect you. And a risk management file is one of the things they will inspect every time they show up at your door if you're a device manufacturing company. They may vary which file they look at. They usually, the first time they're there, they'll look at your highest risk product to the patient. The next time, the next lowest, highest risk, and so on, till they get through all of them. That won't stop them. If they see a problem with a file, they might dig into the other ones as well to see if that problem's a systemic issue. So that concludes my portion of this discussion. What we'd like to do now is open this up to Q&A and answer any questions you have in the next few minutes. And remember what I said earlier, that you're certainly welcome to think of something after we conclude this and contact me in the next couple of days. We'll send a question and answer to all of you in attendance. If it's beyond that, we'll answer each individual question on its own merits or points you in the right direction.
Sounds
So I'll turn
great.
this attention back to Amy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And everyone, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. Our first question is from Elliot. And Elliot, yes, I did email the slides to all the participants about, I don't know, 2 hours maybe before the presentation. So check your email and check your spam folder. And if you don't see them, send me a note back. The next question, how do you develop Mecha tables and other risk tree charts? Do you collect the information yourself, or do you bring in a team from different departments and conduct a brainstorming session?
I touched on this, so there's no one way to do this, but like I said, I like to develop these tables and the file itself, the hazard list, the tables. I might start with the hazard list and present the hazard list to the team and have them flesh it out because it's going to drive all the other documents. And then once I have the hazard list complete, and certainly I'd like to have a clinician be a part of looking over the hazard list, then I'll develop, in my case, the fault tree analysis and the 3 failure mode effect and criticality analysis documents. I'll still structure them pretty much by myself. Then I'll start asking other people, like if I'm dealing with the design, I'll talk to my R&D people, I'll talk to marketing, I'll talk to the clinician and get some feedback on that and make sure my list is complete as far as they can see. And the same goes for the production one, and the same goes for the use. So I'll involve marketing in the use. I'll look at the CAPA documents, non-conformances, complaints primarily. Also what's true in the field. Some of the, I'll maybe talk to some of my compatriots in other companies through a QA RAPS organization, not revealing any confidential information, but find out if they're having similar type problems with the products they make, if they're a similar type of product or similar manufacturing process to make a different type of product that could affect my documents. And after having exhausted those sources, then I'll present that document to the team. And we'll go through all of that. Again, with the review by a clinician involved. In almost all cases, I've been able to find a clinician, and I highly recommend it. So that's what I prefer. And then it's not a pure brainstorming session because you're actually starting with a starting point. You have a document to start with. The reason I say this is I have taken a team cold and just say, hey, we've got the responsibility here and we need to develop a hazard list. We need to do a fault tree analysis. We need to do 3 Mechas. So let's get started on the hazard list. And you'd be surprised the arguments involved. How do we do this? How far do we go on that? Well, I think this should be included, and I don't. I find it a lot easier to present the team with a accomplished fact that's 80, 90% there, or even 50 or 60% there, and let them work from that. It cuts down a lot of this initial confusion and argument and whatever. And now they're actually focusing on specific items, and they can see if something's missing, and they can also see what's there maybe that shouldn't be there or should be changed. And that's to me, it's a lot easier to work with that. And that's the technique I've used as a consultant as well as when I was an employee to better effect. That's my own personal reason. You may have a better approach yourself with the type of people you're working with, where maybe the technique that's mentioned in this question would be more suitable. Our next question, what is the ideal approach to develop Mecha tables and other risk analysis assessment charts? Well, I have my own template, if you will, but as I mentioned, you go on the internet and you get all kinds of templates. I recommend if you have engineers that are already familiar with these, having done them maybe in engineering school, I have found that to be true in some companies. I just use what they're already done. I don't try to reinvent the wheel or train them on some other format. I just adapt what they've done, make sure it's complete, maybe add an extra column if I need to, and go with what they're already familiar with and comfortable with, maybe even have them train the rest of the team on how they do these things. But the ideal approach is if you have one that's already done from a previous product that's very similar, I would start with that. If you don't, if you're starting totally from scratch, put down some of the obvious things, break it down into categories like design you've got the actual product itself and some of the components to it. If you've got software, you've got that. So you've got several categories. You could even break it into various categories: the hardware, software, packaging, production process, etc. In your use, in your design for Mecha, and then start fleshing them out. Some you may know because of your job in the company. Maybe you're a manufacturing engineer, so you already know production issues, and you know some of the design issues and how to make a R&D design into a commercially viable product, and how to set up a production line. So you may be able to flesh a lot of that out. I did both of those things, manufacturing engineering, QA engineering, when I was an employee. So I was already familiar with what was involved in getting a production line up, and the design elements of a product, and what was involved in several of the products I was responsible for. So later on, when I was at a QA engineer, and later on brought back at this one company as a consultant because of the FDA issues, I was able to utilize that background to understand the products we were looking at least a lot of the ones I was involved with. So there's no one way to do any of these. And depending on your experience and the experience of your team and the amount of documentation you have in your company and the freeness of your culture and talking with one another and trying to help one another, will determine the aid or lack of aid and assistance you get on these projects. Your team, you should select your team if you have that option, and I did, in terms of people that are work well together, that aren't argumentative, that aren't my way or the highway, that are amenable to logical arguments of one approach versus another, and are willing to come up with this consensus with the bottom line, the safety of the patient. That's the selection of your team is really a key point of any project, quite frankly. And if you're totally new in a company, that's rough. But if you have some experience, you quickly start to know who are the team players, who are the ones that want to get a deliverable out that's safe, versus those who just want to hog the limelight, to gather all the praise to themselves, that kind of a thing. As a team leader, I was very interested in making sure that the team members got recognition. We had a company newspaper. I made sure individuals got recognition by name. I used part of my budget to give awards, cross pens back then, very favorable received, meals to nice restaurants in town for an individual and their significant other, that kind of a thing, as acknowledgement. I try to really acknowledge others rather than obtain glory to myself, so to speak. Actually, their success rubbed off on me because our team was successful. But that's the way I viewed it. And that's the way the approach I would recommend anyone else view it. Share the fame, share the success.
Great advice.
That kind of a thing.
Right. Great advice. I don't see any other questions at this point, and it is just after 2:00. So I'll thank everyone for joining us. Thank you for such a great presentation, John. If you have not already registered, John is presenting a webinar on 510Ks on April 19th. We invite you to join us for that. I'll include a link in our wrap-up email. Thanks again for joining us, everyone, today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a lot of good information. Take care.